Okay, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are good to start. We are mostly all present now. So I would like to warmly welcome you all to the launch of the Asia Pacific Migration Data Report 2021. The event is also held as a side event to the ESCAP's 8th session of the Committee on Statistics. And so we are joined live by some participants and delegates in Bangkok, while the rest of us are online. But thankfully, we are all here celebrating the importance of data in evidence-based decision-making. A few housekeeping issues before we go ahead. So please note, first of all, that this webinar will be recorded. And throughout this event, if you have questions to the speakers, you're very welcome to raise them anytime during the presentation through the Q&A function. However, because we have a very short time for this entire event, we will not be able to address your questions directly during the time frame of this event, but colleagues and technical specialists will respond to your questions via email following the event if you have any. But when sending a question, please provide your name, email, and organization along with the question so that we are able to get back to you. We do have a very packed agenda, so let's get started. Opening remarks today will be given by Mr. Stuart Simpson, who is the Deputy Regional Director of the IOM Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Stuart has over 20 years of experience working on migration, development, and emergency response spanning Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Before joining the regional office, he was the Chief of Mission and Special Envoy with the IOM mission in Afghanistan. And before that, he did stints in the North Pacific and Mozambique, to name a few places. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Peppy. And I think I'm unmuted successfully, so you should be able to hear me loudly and clearly. First off, I'd like to welcome all our partners and colleagues attending this event, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the launch of the Asia Pacific Migration Data Report 2021. On behalf of the IOM Regional Data Hub and the wider IOM Asia Pacific team, let me express my gratitude for the participation in this launch of IOM's Deputy Director General, Hugo Daniels, and the Director of the Statistics Division in ESCAP, Rachel Bevan. Good afternoon, Hugo, and good afternoon, Rachel. As a side event to ESCAP's 8th season on the Committee of Statistics, I also welcome the report's Regional Data Hub resource speakers, who will in turn share with you the report's key findings on migration dynamics in this region. When the recent pandemic took force in 2020, it was pretty much impossible to guess how long it would last or how severe its effects would be. However, looking back now in 2022, we can look over the previous year as a period of transition, however, still rocked by new waves of the pandemic and also finding a way to recover from it. Now, although pandemic-related border closures and movement restrictions decreased, they still really remained a part of life across the region, affecting migrants' paths and ease of travel. 2021, unfortunately, also saw many humanitarian crises across the region that added to the pre-existing mobility challenges that the migrants in the region faced. These included natural disasters, ongoing conflict, unfortunately, which I was part of in Afghanistan, and the economic downturn. Very importantly, remember, data provides critical tools for monitoring national and regional progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Compact on Migration, and the Migration Governance Indicators. As such, data creates the potential to change development outcomes while ensuring no one is left behind, which is very important because we must remember that it's the people, the migrants, are the focus of what we do, and data enables us to be able to assist them. To contribute to these objectives, the Regional Data Hub has launched the Asia Pacific Migration Data Report. This report seeks to consolidate the latest available migration data in the Asia Pacific region and discuss observed trends, especially through the lens of, as I mentioned, the ongoing recovery from the pandemic. With time in mind, I will hand you back to our moderator, Peppy, and wish you a wonderful afternoon. And I see Hugo has joined us. I saw her pop in there, and very good to see her. But handing you back to you, Peppy, okay? Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart, for your welcoming remarks and putting that pin on why data is so important. So we are particularly honored today to have two keynote speakers joining us who will share insights on the importance and potential of strengthening the regional evidence base for migration. We'll start with Ms. Hugo Daniels, who is the IOM Deputy Director General for Operations, She has over 27 years of diverse managerial experience with donor and United Nations entities, academia, as well as private sector. Her career with the United Nations spans almost 2 decades, and prior to joining IOM, Ms. Daniels was the Chief of Staff at the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA. She was also the United Nations Resident Coordinator in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Prior to that, Ms. Daniels was the Chief of Humanitarian and Fragile Context Branch at the United Nations Populations Fund, covering over 70 countries where UNFPA was responding to emergencies. Also, very importantly, she was named a Shiro of the United Nations for championing women's health needs in humanitarian emergencies. So with that, over to you, Hugo Daniels.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon, colleagues. Murphy's Law in total effect because my laptop connection didn't work. I'm joining with my phone, so if I look and sound a bit strange, please bear with me. But having said that, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really honored and pleased to be here to give this very short address on the launch of the Asia Pacific Migration Data Report for 2021 at this session of the ESCAP's Committee on Statistics. So I first of all have to start off by thanking the Regional Data Hub team, researchers, analysts, who really contributed to this report, as well as our expert peer reviewers to enable this really rich and insightful volume that's being launched. Our collective aim in delivering this collaborative research is to inform the development of effective policy and programmatic responses for the Asia Pacific. And I also have to thank all of you for spending your time with us this morning, this afternoon, to listen to us regarding the report. So there are a couple of things that I'd like to start off with by recalling. First and foremost of which is that nearly half of the world's population lives in the Asia Pacific region. And as of mid-2020, nearly 1/3 of all international immigrants originated from the region. And 15% of the global international migrant population are also hosted in the region. So among all migrants in the region, almost 82% came from, almost all migrants in the world, almost 82% came from the Asia Pacific countries, making the most migration region in the world. So, and projections for the next 3 decades expect the outflow to be higher than the inflow. In the last 2 decades, the total number of individuals who migrated from Asia Pacific has increased by almost 80%. However, it's really important to highlight that as of mid-2020, more than 42% of these immigrants were residing in other countries within the region. Now, we also know that last year, nearly half of all new internal displacements globally took place in the region. And that's more than 20 million IDPs, new IDPs, largely displaced by disasters. The conflict in Afghanistan has triggered forced migration of nearly 2 million individuals within and out of Afghanistan following the de facto government transition. Similarly, the conflict in Myanmar displaced thousands of people from their homes. So the region also, as you all well know, having lived it, has faced successive waves of COVID-19 infections brought on by new variants, which lengthened the pandemic and left the responses to it uncertain. Restrictions continue to infect internal migration as well. And last year's data shows that a significant number of countries in the region were still under national emergency regulations that included controls on internal mobility. Let me emphasize that Asia Pacific countries had more internal COVID-19 restrictions in 2021 than the rest of the world. This report shows how these and many other elements of migration in the region were interconnected and provide a revealing view of the year's migration trends. Every single one of the tens of millions of migrant stories is unique, but we can all agree that the ever-arching story of migration for the region last year was one of resilience in spite of the growing challenges. In particular, the resilience of remittance flows in the region is remarkable. The region received nearly $306 billion of remittance inflows, surpassing pre-pandemic levels. And that is, I mean, beyond remarkable if you think about what the impact on mobility had been. Host countries' support schemes and stimulus packages allowed migrants to continue providing financial support to their families by sending home even higher amounts than before. And what the report outlines is that the situation of migrants in the region, and looking at different types of migration, labor migration corridors, conflict and disaster-related displacement, and return migration flows, providing key findings on migrants' access to COVID-19 recovery plans and the challenges faced by migrants from socioeconomic risks to smuggling, trafficking, and the dangers experienced on migration routes. Overall, migrants have found ways to rebuild their lives in the midst of uncertainty, and in doing so have contributed to the recovery from the pandemic, as well as regional development more broadly. And I think this is a really, really important point, not only in the face of the impact of COVID on internal migration and the barriers, but also in terms of the narrative around migration and the significant contribution migrants have played in the response, but also in recovery to the pandemic. And their resilience is actually enabling the resilience of countries, as we have seen with the remittance flows, in terms of their recovery. So overall, migrants have found ways to rebuild their lives in the midst of uncertainty, as I'd said before, but they've been at the heart of global recovery. Now, looking ahead, the lives of migrants in the region will doubtless continue to be affected by such conditions for years to come. And therefore, it's really important to seek innovative ways to analyze data to inform policy that supports migrants, advocates for them, and demonstrates consistently their contributions to recovery. Their role in driving economic recovery, cultural interchange, and innovation in the region cannot be overemphasized. Now, moving on to the importance of migration data. As we know, migration is a complex phenomenon and too frequently misunderstood or misinterpreted, or worse still, instrumentalized. To understand trends and their consequences for migrants, we need quality, accessible, disaggregated, reliable, and timely data on migration that reflects the rich complexity and fast-paced dynamics of the movement of people in the region. In particular, further disaggregation by sex, age, and other relevant varieties, such as gender, renders crucial insights into the diverse experiences and, in some cases, systematic differences within the migrant population marked by great heterogeneity. Data is needed to inform policymakers and humanitarian efforts. They're essential in targeting and reaching areas of need. They allow us to understand migrant lives and migrant journeys. It's fundamental to international efforts to achieve the 2030 agenda, as well as the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. In other words, without data, we cannot know whether the region is progressing towards a sustainable world and doing so in a way that leaves no one behind. So how can the regional data hubs work, bridge the gaps that I've just talked about? as I conclude, I just want to say a few words on this. And although the hub is relatively new, its body of work is growing with significant reports such as this one, which provide the information through capacity building, technical oversight of IOM's data collection and analysis activities in more than 20 countries of the region. The Data Hub has elevated its work for the region and regional trends analysis and dissemination. These efforts have contributed to strengthening data in the region and advancing humane and orderly migration that benefits migrants, but more importantly, all of society. So I conclude very happily by expressing my confidence that going forward with this report will provide regular analysis of the most pressing migration issues of the year and will provide evidence-based guidance for our partners and all of your future endeavors. Forthcoming reports of the Regional Data Hub on the SDGs and thematic topics will also add depth to that analysis and hopefully will stitch together an indicative patchwork that covers migration in Asia and the Pacific. I'm therefore pleased to hand over to my colleagues to share with us more insights on this event. And thank you once again for having this opportunity to speak to you about what for me personally in my role as the DDG for operations at IOM is really, really exciting work, but more importantly, and as I said, this is the basis, this is what gives us the basis for all of our advocacy, and this is our collective advocacy and our collective programming to ensure a better world for all and to really harness the benefits of migration while also mitigating the adverse effects of migration that's not regular, not orderly, not humane. And so with that, I hand back to my colleagues and thank you very much.
Thank you, DDG Daniels, for your insights and for highlighting some of the complex drivers of migration, the challenges migrants face in this region, and the need for disaggregated data, all backed by evidence from our migration data report. We will now hear from the second keynote speaker, Ms. Rachel Bevan, Director of Statistics Division at ESCAP. Ms. Bevan has over 30 years of experience in government statistics, in particular data preparation and analysis. She has also worked extensively with governments, multilateral agencies, and the statistical community, most notably through the United Nations Statistics Division, ECA, ESCAP, World Bank, and Paris 21. So Ms. Bevan, the floor is literally yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity to be able to speak today at the launch of IOM's Asia Pacific Migration Data Report. And I know a few weeks ago when I received the invitation to speak, I was thinking, oh no, I'll have to say no because I knew that I'd be busy with the Committee on Statistics. But I'm very glad that we were able to find a way such that we could actually manage this and actually really use this opportunity to actually enable a lot wider audience to actually be here for the launch. And it's great to actually have some real people in the room that I'm in. I know the other speakers haven't got that same luxury. And also the other added advantage with having real people is we also had a real lunch, thanks to IOM as well. And so that was also great and a really good opportunity for networking. But we know that this report really comes, as others have said, at an important time as across the world countries are looking to recover from the devastating impact of COVID-19 pandemic. But it's also an important week for us here at ESCAP as we've been meeting together with countries for the 8th Committee on Statistics. And this week we're discussing how national statistical officers can cope with that rising demand for granular real-time data. And migration is clearly one of those areas where we see that demand for data continuing to increase. And whilst migration has always taken place, what we've seen in those last few years is an increase, both in terms of the scale of migration, but also in terms of the impact on individual lives. And as others have said as well, in Asia and the Pacific region, we see countries which are the origin, also the destination and the transit point for migrants. And in the region, we see that 2 countries, Afghanistan and Myanmar, rank among the top 5 countries where refugees worldwide have come from. But then we also see within the region 2 other countries, Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are among the top 10 countries hosting the largest number of refugees. So we can see, you know, from this that there's a massive kind of variation across the region. We've also seen how conflict as well as disasters have led to that increase in migration and displacement in recent years. But whilst we all know that migration takes place, we often don't have that granular real-time data to actually show the scale of the issue, nor the really detailed information that we need to be able to determine what are the most appropriate policies to be able to promote safe, orderly, and regular migration. We also know that collecting data on migration is difficult, and there are multiple challenges which need to be addressed. Many migrants are distrustful, can often be unwilling to take part in surveys or to provide information. There can also be lots of language issues as people move between areas and often between countries. We've also seen, you know, recently the speed at which migration takes place means that a situation could deteriorate very rapidly, or for example, with natural disasters, and it can lead to mass movements of people over very short periods of time, which means as statisticians, we then need to be there to actually be able to measure what that impact is. But because of these difficulties in collecting migration data, it's really crucial that we work together to collect the data which is needed. And this means we need UN agencies and entities to work with country governments, as well as with civil society and other local organizations to collate comprehensive information. But we also need to strengthen the underlying country data systems, including births and death registrations, as well as census data. Indeed, across Asia and the Pacific, in 2019, we estimated there were around 64 million children whose births had not been registered. And this means that many of those children are left without a legal identity, which can create serious barriers in terms of them accessing health, education, or other services. And we know that migrants, non-citizens, asylum seekers, refugees, and stateless people are often a big part of that group. What we can also see from this report is that there are a range of opportunities to really improve the data on migration. We can see how big data sources like mobile phone call records and satellite imagery can complement, not replace, but complement other more traditional sources of data. But we know that the issue of migration is complex with a range of push and pull factors. And in this report, we're seeing the different types of migration, as well as a huge host of information on the specific vulnerabilities that different groups are facing. So here at ESCAP, we're very happy to work closely with IOM, as we are with other important UN partners like UNHCR, to strengthen data systems which are needed to underpin reports such as this one. But before I close and pass on to others who are going to give more detail on the report, I just also want to remind everyone that behind every single number is a real person, a man, a woman, child, each with their own very unique story of how they've had to move, often leaving behind family members, friends, homes, and livelihoods. But along with those stories of huge loss, we also hear many, many stories of hope. And I hope that as we work together, we can strengthen migration statistics to provide a solid evidence base for decision makers so they can develop the most appropriate policies to promote safe and orderly regular migration and to change each of these stories of loss into a story of hope. But I'd like to take this opportunity to really thank IOM for their work and to wish them a very successful launch. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Ms. Bevan, for the insights to the demands that better migration data also puts on national statistics offices and challenges to collecting that data, including the issues around lack of legal identity, which is something that, of course, has really come up over the recent years. The next set of speakers from the IOM Asia Pacific Regional Data Hub will take us through highlighting from the Asia Pacific Migration Data Report some of the key findings. So first, we'll have Chandan Nayak, who is the head of IOM's Asia Pacific Data Hub, and he will give us some background to the regional data hub and this report. And he is joined by RDH research and analysis team, who will then present the highlights from the report, The team includes Annie Yip-Ching Yu, Gabriela Alvarez Sanchez, Emanuele Alvarosa, and Jessamine Ruth Bronvik. Over to you, Chandan.
Thanks, Pepe. Hello, everyone. As Pepe said, I'm Chandan Naik, and I'm the head of IOM's Regional Data Hub for Asia Pacific. Once again, I thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Didi, Daniel, Stuart, and Rachel for those valuable remarks. Indeed, the joint effort on strengthening migration data is what the Regional Data Hub has been striving for in collaboration with the UN agencies, government partners, and other stakeholders. It is also why we are here today to present to you our annual flagship migration data report, an effort from us to consolidate the evidence base for migration in this region. I'll begin with a brief introduction to our unit before the team shares highlights from the migration report itself. The Regional Data Hub is a unit within IOM's Regional Office for Asia and Pacific that was established in July 2020. The same time that IOM's Global Migration Data Strategy, or MDS, was developed, which was designed within the framework of the IOM's strategic vision. The RDH is building a body of work, including our national secondary data reviews and the broader scale regional secondary data review. We provide thematic studies that add depth to research on migration-related topics, in addition to capacity building that will hopefully broaden it. All these efforts are capped by our flagship annual migration data report. Going forward, we are working towards collaborations and growing expertise in migration data in the region. Next slide, please. In recent decades, we observe a growing volume of migration data being collected by different stakeholders. However, the wealth of information has remained largely scattered. This implies that there is also an increasing need for a reliable, nuanced, and harmonized evidence base that can reflect current, historical, and future migration development in the region, aid policymaking as well as operations, inform public discourse on migration. RDH is responding to this need. We are aiming to centralize information from the region, leverage quantitative insights, harmonize data processes, and promote good data practice. As such, our three key objectives, which are on your screen, are strengthening the regional evidence base on migration through RDH products such as Regional Secondary Data Review, Migration Data Report, and several research studies covering RDH migration theme, which I will be talking later. Capacity building of IOM offices and relevant partners, and ensuring more evidence-based IOM and UN-wide engagement. Since RDH began, we have been seeking partnerships, collaborations, and broader engagement with entities and organizations working with migration data in the region and beyond. RDH is also working closely with and supporting IOM country offices in the region regarding the areas of this objective. At RDH, we work with 6 broad migration thematic pillars. This helps us identify migration data themes or indicators with respective sustainable development goals, as well as with the Global Compact for Migration objectives. The 6th pillar, migration and innovation, was introduced this year. We believe that this approach will be beneficial to migration practitioners who are looking at links between migration data with SDG and the Global Compact for Migration. In our reports, we try to connect migration data and indicators with SDGs and GCM. You will see later in the presentation the clear links between these entities. The Migration Data Report 2021 is an extension of our last year's Migration Data Report 2020. Together, the two reports consolidate the latest data from the region. They cover the height of COVID-19 pandemic and the transition into recovery from it. And they provide much needed strength to the evidence base on migration in the region that we were talking about. Next slide. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to RDH team to discuss the report in more depth. So I'll hand over to Gabriela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chandan, for this introduction. And yeah, I will now start presenting the main findings of our report, starting from our first migration pillar of analysis, migration and policy, which essentially shapes the context in which migration took place during the COVID-19 pandemic by the introduction of mobility restrictions. Even as the pandemic was expected to ease, as we know, new variants of the coronavirus created new impetus to reduce movement. And by saying this, there are two sides to this coin. We have border entry restrictions and internal restrictions. Asia and the Pacific was among the top 3 regions in the world with the highest number of imposed entry restrictions in 2021. And by the end of 2021 as well, only 11% of all points of entry were indicated as fully closed. And this corresponds to a slight decrease in government stringency across the region comparable to 2020. Internal movement restrictions also were observed in 30 out of 40 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. And while South Asia showed the highest level of internal controls, the Pacific region showed the lowest. But not only during 2021, but stretching back to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. And now looking into our second pillar, migration and statistics, the analysis of the available data has showed that individuals migrating from Asia-Pacific countries almost doubled over the last 20 years. And this was mainly driven by impressive growth rates observed among immigrants from South Asia and Southeast Asia. Also, more than 34 million out of nearly 83 million immigrants from Asia and the Pacific migrated to other countries in the region, in particular to India, Australia, Thailand, and Malaysia. I would like to highlight that the number of immigrants hosted in the region has also been growing over the last 2 decades, increasing by almost 40%. However, it remains substantially lower than the number of immigrants from the region. Another important finding in our report is that migration links between Asia-Pacific and African countries have become stronger over the last 2 decades, reflecting deepening economic and cultural relations between these 2 regions.
Moving on, we've reached our third and most wide-ranging thematic pillar, which covers 6 types of migration that are of particular significance in Asia and the Pacific. We'll start with labor migration. It is estimated that 24 million, that is 14% of international migrant workers, were hosted in the Asia-Pacific region. Nearly 40% were female migrant workers. Country-level analysis shows that stagnations largely characterize the inflow and stock of migrant workers in the main destinations in this region. Although gradual resumption was seen in the deployment of workers overseas from main Asia-Pacific origin countries in 2021, the number was still distant from pre-pandemic levels. Fluctuations in labor migration flows remain closely tied to the direct and indirect impacts of COVID-19, mainly travel bans amid new waves of outbreaks. Moving on to forced migration, a total of 9.5 million people from Asia-Pacific countries were forcibly displaced due to conflicts and violence as of mid-2021. That includes 5.5 million refugees and asylum seekers and 4 million internally displaced people. Most were from Afghanistan and Myanmar, with further increases due to the upscaling of the Afghanistan and Myanmar crisis. In the case of Afghanistan, IOM identified nearly 1 million people as newly internally displaced after the political changes in August 2021. Asia and the Pacific also hosted 4.2 million refugees and asylum seekers as of mid-2021. Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Iran were among the top 9 largest asylum countries in the world, as well as the largest asylum countries in this region, accounting for 75% of all refugees and asylum seekers hosted in this region. In 2021, the Asia-Pacific region was strongly hit by seasonal floods, tropical storms, cyclones, and droughts. Afghanistan was struck by a severe drought that affected nearly 80% of people in the country. Nearly 557,000 new disaster displacements were recorded in Indonesia by mid-2021, largely due to floods, representing 50,000 new displacements over the same period in 2020. Super Typhoon Rai brought torrential rains, violent winds, landslides, and storm surges in the Philippines, displacing nearly 4 million people between the 16th and 21st of December. By 2050, without concrete climate action, climate change is projected to lead 37 million people to migrate within their countries in East Asia and Pacific, 36 million people in South Asia, and 6.3 million in the lower Mekong sub-region. As mass returns of migrants to their origin countries were simultaneously sparked and halted by lockdown measures and border closures due to COVID-19, migrants continue to return spontaneously or with the support of government and other actors. IOM is one of the key actors in this area. In 2021, IOM assisted more than 7,000 migrants to return voluntarily to their countries of origin in Asia and the Pacific. 70% of IOM assisted voluntary returns hosted in Asia Pacific countries were intra-regional. When it comes to forced return, more than 9,000 nationals of Asia Pacific countries returned from European Union countries following an order to leave between the first and third quarter of 2021. Stark gender imbalance is seen among this group, where male adults dominated and 6% were minors younger than 18 years. And more than 1 million Afghans returned from Iran and Pakistan in 2021 as of November. The majority of whom were deported. Returnees often face a multitude of economic, social, health, and psychological challenges upon return. Although the understanding of reintegration experiences of returning migrants has been largely hindered by data scarcity, existing evidence shows systematic differences in the reintegration outcomes between forced and voluntary returnees, especially when such returns are made to a fragile context. Moving on, Asia and the Pacific is a region where some of the world's most significant internal movements take place. Data scarcity and limitations in the region is a major constraint to understanding internal migration and urbanization. Despite large data gaps, the latest available data show that some of the traditional urban centers were seeing a decline in net internal migration in 2021. The pandemic might only be one of the disruptors in this trend, bringing attention to a potentially ongoing paradigm shift driven by a range of underlying factors, which will need to be confirmed by more and future evidence.
The effects of the COVID-19 pandemic continued to shape irregular migration in 2021. Borders started being gradually or partially opened as the year went on, but not evenly and often with restrictions, including health restrictions, of course. Economic needs and crises continued to act as migration drivers, but then as regular routes were made more difficult to travel, there was added impetus to migrate irregularly. Irregular migration is difficult to analyze due to aspects such as stigma, difficulty finding a definition of irregularity and its inherent clandestine nature, and all of these contribute to data scarcity. So given the lack of complete and reliable data on this subject, whether there was an increase or decrease in irregular migration in 2021 in the Asia Pacific region is unclear. However, it is clear that irregular routes and migration behaviors shifted through the year in response to a change in context, whether by way of migrant smugglers working less passively, which means that they were recruiting more actively this year, or by migrants traveling more dangerous irregular routes. This is concluding our types of migration. So I'll move on to our next pillar, which is migration and vulnerabilities. Our fourth pillar focuses on migration, covering emergencies, trafficking, and migrant deaths and disappearances. So I'll begin with emergencies, where we look closely at two types that intensified vulnerabilities severely: the pandemic and forced migration. As to the pandemic, migrants are overrepresented in groups that are hardest hit, but they're often excluded from the policies that are meant to ameliorate the effects, including vaccination programs and social safety nets. So 2021 saw more inclusion of migrants in relief programs and noted improvements over 2020. But those efforts were sporadic and uneven across the region. You can see here multiple increased vulnerabilities that I don't have time to delve into. So for that, you're going to have to look at the report, but I want to note them and to point out that the pandemic was linked to heightened violence against women and girls, increased poverty rates, and loss of access to education, meaning that it continued to create new challenges for migrants in vulnerable situations. and to intensify pre-existing ones. Moving on to forced displacement, Myanmar saw political changes in February 2021 that coincided with increased violence across the country and forced thousands to migrate in search of safety. In addition, tens of thousands of Rohingya refugees already in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, were left with less hope of returning home to Myanmar. Overcrowding and lack of resources therefore characterize the situation of those forcibly displaced. Afghanistan experienced increasing violence leading up to the withdrawal of international troops and a government transition in August. A drought, ongoing conflict, the COVID-19 pandemic, and increasing poverty led to 18 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. So by the end of 2021, we counted 18 million people who needed humanitarian assistance, and the ongoing and intensifying complex humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan forced the displacement of tens of thousands into neighboring countries and further afield.
Thank you, Josie. We can share some quick numbers with you on migrants' deaths and disappearance. Even though it is a more complex issue, which is very, very well covered by the work of the IOM Missing Migrant Project. In 2021, reported deaths and disappearance occurring in the Asia Pacific countries amounted to 810 individuals, which is around 14% of the global figures. Also, in 2021, more than 500 reported migration incidents took place worldwide that led to the death or disappearance of migrants from Asia Pacific. And more than 900 victims were originally from the region, 61 of whom were from unknown countries. And most of these deaths concern migrants from Afghanistan, who represented 72% of the total figures. Also, these figures account for the minimum estimate based on indirect sources such as social and traditional media. Therefore, it's important to highlight that there is an urgent need to improve in official data collection activities by national governments, and with the aim to obtain better data and information on missing migrants. Moving on trafficking in persons, in 2021, IOM assisted over 700 victims of human trafficking originating from Asia Pacific countries. And 58% were men and 17% of the identified victims were children, mainly from Bangladesh and Myanmar. Forced labor constituted the primary type of exploitation in 2021. With 52% of all the victims reported being controlled by physical and psychological abuse. In 2021, nearly 3/4 of IOM-assisted victims from Asia Pacific countries were exploited within the region, making intra-regional human trafficking predominant in the Asia and the Pacific.
Thank you very much, Gabi. So this brings us to our pillar on migration and development. And as we mentioned before, remittances were resilient in 2021. In fact, our findings indicate that inflows increased in 17 out of 36 countries and areas in the region. Across the region, the inflow of remittances increased by 2% overall with respect to 2020. Now, the link between the size of the diaspora and the source of remittance inflows is also very evident in the findings. The latest migration figures show that most of the top destinations for Pakistani, Philippine, and Bangladeshi immigrants were also among the top major source countries of remittance inflows. Our report also investigates recent developments in cross-border trade. We find that the pandemic affected cross-border trade substantially, increasing traders' vulnerability and limiting their capacity to contribute to economic recovery. Next slide, please. Now, our final pillar is on migration and innovation, which is a new thematic area that we're exploring. The first aspect we want to focus on is the important contribution that innovative data sources can make to the analysis of migration trends in terms of complementing traditional sources and obviously not substituting them. These innovative sources include, among others, mobile phone and internet-based data, as well as satellite imagery. In many contexts, these sources can provide timely information and levels of geographical resolution that are often unmatched by other types of data. However, it is true that there exist some important challenges to effectively use this data. Some of the most notable obstacles include the difficulty of accessing private data repositories and the lack of technical capabilities to process and analyze the data. Now, the second aspect we look at is how the new research methods and data solutions that have been developing in the last few years can substantially benefit public migration policies and humanitarian operations in areas such as forecasting, scenario analysis, and modeling of migration trends, among others. However, all these often depend on readily available, comprehensive quality migration information. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the conclusion of our report and to the main takeaways. Overall, we see that 2021 was a turbulent year for Asia and the Pacific. We saw heightened conflict and increasing severity of climate events, but we also bore witness to a remarkable resilience of migrants and a resurgence of some migration pathways. Disaggregated, representative, and internationally comparable data are fundamental for evidence-based policies and program design in the region. As we have noted, there are still significant data gaps. Yet, valuable knowledge can be provided by investigating the data that are currently available. This Migration Data Report 2021 has done just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the RDH team for sharing with us the key findings on the migration data in the Asia-Pacific region. That was a lot to take on, but we're all glad to know it's collected into a digestible report format that we can all access later on and study at our leisure. Quick reminder to the participants that if you have any questions on the report for the presenters, please raise it through the Q&A function along with your name, email, and affiliation. The RDH team will get back to you, but unfortunately we don't have time for Q&A during the session. We're on a very tight timeline. And that leads us to the closing remarks segment of our event, where we are pleased to have Pablo Rojas Copari, the Senior Research Officer with the Migration Research and Publications Division from IOM headquarters, to give us the closing remarks. Before joining IOM in 2021, Pablo was the Migration Advisor of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He also held positions in the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, as well as civil society organizations. But with that, over to you, Pablo.
Thank you very much. Good morning from Geneva. Good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I would like to express the disappointment of the head of our division, Mary McAuliffe, who could not make it today, but I'm grateful to be able to replace her in this really important event. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Regional Data Hub. And thank you for putting together this great report, this great effort in developing the second edition of the Asia-Pacific Migration Data Report, which we always look forward to. Many thanks to our DDG Ugochi Daniels, to Mrs. Rachel Bevan, as well as all the speakers who took us through the content of this report today. I have made a number of notes on this, and I'm happy to come out with a lot of really information. I believe today's presentation covered and gave an overall insight on the different migration and mobility dynamics in the region, covering a period starting from the pandemic and going through efforts in recovery. We also saw that in the region, it was a period of intensified conflict, a number of crises, but at the same time, new opportunities, mainly to the implementation, thanks to the implementation of new technologies and exploiting big data. Looking at the different pillars, themes, and sub-themes, this presentation and this report really provides us a reeling view of the year's migration trend. What we saw, to take just a few key messages, we saw that labor migration is slowly resuming, picking pace. There has been a strong resilience in remittance inflows in the regions in 2021, just as it was seen in the year 2020, and as well as the beginning of economic recovery and higher growth in relation to the preceding year. A lot of the remittance efforts were supported by the diaspora from the Asia-Pacific region and were benefited throughout the region. We do still have a lot to learn and a lot to investigate in relation to the recovery, and we're looking forward to next year's report in this regard. What we have also noticed, and as was mentioned in the presentation, there are significant data gaps in the region. For example, we do not have enough data on internal migration and mobility. We do still need to find ways to understand irregular migration flows and stocks. We need to find better ways to obtain comprehensive information in order to provide evidence-based migration governance and humanitarian work in the region. As we all know, the improved data collection and analysis is a key objective of the Global Compact for Migration. In fact, it's objective number 1. It calls for the collection and utilization of accurate and disaggregated data as a basis for evidence-based policies. Closing data gaps through new methods and innovative technologies will help fulfill this GCM objective, but also will help us achieve broader goals such as the SDGs and our MGIs, the Migration Governance Indicators. Nonetheless, despite the gaps that were mentioned, we can still learn a lot, as we have seen, by investigating what available data exists. This report has shown that this is possible. It not only has exposed and analyzed our data, it has also provided valuable recommendation on how to close data gaps and how to strengthen evidence base for migration. In this regard, further joint efforts can build upon the foundation and evidence of this that this report presents. Having said that, I would like to thank you all for attending. We hope that you have learned a lot from today's discussion, and we're looking forward to to receiving your questions and comments, and we will leave you with the insights of this work. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you, Pablo, and RDH colleagues. I hope you heard that. We are all already looking forward to next year's report. It's a shame that data analysis always takes a bit of time. But before we close, we would like to draw your attention to a few more things. First of all, you may find the links to the RDH Asia Pacific Migration Report and the Regional Secondary Data Review on the slide. Data-oriented as we are, we would also like to ask you for your help to fill in a short post-webinar survey, and the link has been shared in the chat, so you can just open it up from there. There's an email address that you can contact the RDH team through, and follow us on Twitter if you want to continue these conversations, or you are interested in a partnership, have a lot of great data to share. We are always open to hear from you. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for your participation, and hope to see you next year when we do this again. Thank you.